Dr. Ongama Mtimka, whose PhD was conferred this year, is no stranger to this program. On multiple occasions, Dr. Mtimka provided thought-provoking analysis on the state of South African politics and governance. He joins me now from Gqeberha. Dr. Mtimka, thank you very much for your time. Hearty congratulations once again from the Watchdog team.
Good evening, Vuya and your team and your listeners. Thank you for having me this evening.
Well, roller coaster year it has been for you. Take us back, if you will, to your thesis, what it was about.
Sure. So it was titled A Political Economy of Transformation in Nelson Mandela Bay, a critical analysis of the construction sector since 2005. And what it's about is looking at the rise of what I call political entrepreneurs, people in Nelson Mandela Bay who formed what became known as small business forums, and organized through what is mainly political tactics in order to secure more work for themselves and their members in the construction sector. They started around 2012, and of interest to me was a need to properly understand the rise of groups that use political tactics in order to earn a project in what otherwise is a market economy in South Africa. And I thought that that was important for the discipline. The extreme of it are what have been called the construction mafia. And in fact, even these organizations, the small business forums in Nelson Mandela Bay, started off as mobilizing for more work for their members, but later on became rogue in many ways that resulted in the description of construction mafia being close to the activities that happened here, even as it was in describing what's happening in KZN.
Mm-hmm. I mean, one would imagine, high levels of poverty, unemployment would give rise to phenomena like that. But is there other things? Is there something else that you were able to find, which also of things which may well be big contributing factors as well?
Sure. So there's been an entire field of looking at post-conflict reconstruction and development. What happens when countries begin to bring about development as part of addressing development challenges that were there during a time of conflict or authoritarianism? What I found was that there's a link between the concentration of development taking place and the likelihood of conflict. Just as scholars who have looked at post-conflict reconstruction and development in the African continent have found, we thought in South Africa we were slightly different because of the fact that we didn't have a full-on guerrilla war versus the apartheid state. But in many ways, our society is a post-conflict society. So those things which we have seen in other countries have been manifest here. So, for example, the forums started in Motherwell. And the reason why Motherwell was the start of the forums is because in 2001, former President Thabo Mbeki declared an urban renewal program, in terms of which there was concentrated investment in Motherwell, in Mdantsane, and other places. So, interestingly, the small business forum started in Motherwell around about 2007, contesting forms of representation that existed before, because you had people who were saying, we're seeing infrastructure projects happening here, but we are not participating. Interestingly enough, when the forums spread in the entire city, it was during a time when the city, the municipality, had declared an 80-20 expenditure of the capital budget, 80% towards previously disadvantaged wards. Now, because of increased expenditure in other formerly disadvantaged township. You then had a critical mass of projects, which then triggered again this conflict over who participates in the development of the project. Interestingly, Vuyo, many of these people who formed forums were people who were very much close to the political structure at a local level of a branch executive of the ANC. Either they were members of the branch or they were close to the ward committee. And so there's an interesting correlation between who was likely to form a forum in order to try and secure work and use these means of intimidation and project stoppages, and who were the people who were more, the local elites in those areas. And then lastly, one of the ways in which the forums proliferated faster or spread quite faster was because if you were a forum leader and you were able to sit around the table to negotiate for project, once the people who used to lead forums started being overthrown by others, they would then split from that forum in order to start others. Or as work proliferated to more wards, people moved from organizing at a citywide level to organize at a ward-based level, because that made whoever is organizing at the level of the ward to be first in line in discussions about who must benefit from work, compared to if they organized at a citywide level. So there were many causes of this, and I'm saying at the core of it is what has been common in all post-conflict societies: the rise of new groups that want to contest the new economic spin-offs that are coming, and they want to challenge those that have been dominant before.
I mean, as time went by, certainly from reports over the years, we saw that these groupings had become, or were becoming, a lot more desperate. They were becoming a lot more brazen, and they were a source of many conflicts, and in some instances there were actually deaths.
Absolutely, Vuyo. In the project of the drains alone, I think no less than 7 people were reported to have died. And also, beginning in 2014, we had an incident where a councillor who was seen to be blocking the benefit of a project received a Christmas letter in which there was a bullet, and that marked the extent to which desperation was coming into what otherwise had started as a non-violent, well, less violent and less use of elimination as a tactic. In fact, when I mapped the reporting about the business forums, I saw that, so at the beginning, the general reporting was negative, which means that it was reflecting on negative events such as rogue elements, and then became positive between 2013 and 2014. But the negative reporting superseded positive reporting based on what the forums were doing, to the extent that beyond 2017, 2018, 19, which is the period of the drains, among other things, there was basically no positive reporting about the small business forum. And what that shows is that these forums had become rogue. In fact, I've got a section in my both findings chapter and analysis where I talk about how the use of violence was an interesting phenomenon in this instance, but also not unlike what had happened in Russia, what had happened with Britain when it was catching up with the Spaniards and the Portuguese in maritime empire. Because Neil Ferguson, for example, tells the story of how piracy was Britain's way of catching up with maritime dominion. And at the time they were on the back foot compared to Spain and Portugal. and how Captain Morgan, who's romanticized in the English world, had actually become a rogue who was raiding the vessels of the Spaniards and hijacking them, in fact, for the loot, and that was sanctioned in London. So the point I make is that it seems to be that at the beginning of the transition of a method of production, or at its genesis, or in periods of transition, we tend to see the use of violence by the underside, by those that feel they don't have power or are not included, in order to try and stamp their way or force their way into an economy. And I argue the point in the thesis that unless South Africa engages in more orderly ways of advancing transformation and, in fact, an inclusive society, we are going to see a lot more of these forums or the mafia into other economic sectors. In fact, we are very late for that, because whether it be mining, mining, road transport, fishing, and others, we are already seeing elements of these activities.
Now, staying with your drain example, for a second, I think it's going to be useful, given how that even came about and the political connections that became so obvious, because it was soon after, I think, the Democratic Alliance. The ANC was back in power, and what appeared to have happened was the raiding of municipal coffers, where some 20-odd million rands had to be found, and this money then had to go to this drain cleaning project that was given to these groupings. What then subsequently happened, I hope I'm summarizing this correctly, is that they then robbed one another, the people who were in the leadership positions as chairperson and so on. When they were paid the money, they didn't distribute to the rest. And then, the killings started, and then there were revenge killings and so on. But I want us to explore first that connection between the politicians and these groupings, because it was soon after the ANC was back in power that suddenly coffers had to be raided, money was made available, and this project started.
Yes, so interestingly, Vuyo, when some of my participants spoke about why forums started, they mentioned that neither the business chambers that existed nor politicians had aided their transformation imperatives. And so these groups then started to operate and formed coalitions directly with municipal officials and some politicians before 2016, and were able to actually get a lot of money for the leaders mainly, and then some of the rank and file membership of the forums. And they developed a relationship which all of the participants, which were business forums strangely, spoke openly about, that there were corrupt relationships between municipal officials, between some of these big companies, as well as some politicians, and that the forums had begun to secure a power structure of their own, despite the powers that be, who was the head of infrastructure, for example. But in the coalition period, there rose a close affinity between the administration of Mayor Bobani and Lungisa as the chap, and I think he was in infrastructure. And this idea of trains might have, I think it came during their time. And while there was a good intention, just as there was in the 80-20 principle, where you said, let's spend 80% of the budget in township.
Dr. Mtimka, your thesis, of course, focused on Nelson Mandela Bay, but we've seen this phenomenon elsewhere, in the country, places like eThekwini. We've seen it in some of the mining towns where local people who claim to represent locals would go and make demands, 30% stakes or certain projects be given to them, and so on?
So the reality of the matter is that in many of these host communities that host mining, energy, and other mega projects, there are grievances that exist about the extent to which those projects are failing to ensure that communities benefit in a meaningful way. And as it happens in countries where civil wars break out, there are always existing grievances about a system that's not working. But in order for conflict to arise, elite groups then mobilize around the existing grievances in order to advance their own personal gain and interests, rather than the interests for which they purport to represent. Now, this is where the crux of the problem in South Africa is that you have big business that collaborate with the state throughout history to create environments conducive for exploitation of local resources with no meaningful benefit or transformation and socioeconomic development for host communities or, in fact, the country. Now, we have seen the persistence of that attitude in democratic South Africa, which is why this problem of unemployment, a huge number of people who are neither in employment, education, or training, as SA puts it, has been increasing, and even as the number of the unemployed, has been on unsustainable level, which means that we have an army of people, which the ANC has called in recent discussion document, the lumpen proletariat, who the country is not working for them. And so they form part of the systemic risks that, threaten the very sense of false security that the big business has had since the transition to democracy. We need a new deal in South Africa. We need an economy that is more democratized, and not these battles between big business to consolidate their stranglehold on the economy and ensure that they keep out many people from meaningful participation. South Africa, despite the existence of the Competition Commission, for example, we continue to have big fives in many of the economic sectors in the country. We continue to have a highly concentrated economy which is controlled by very few people. And for as long as we are not making deliberate attempts to democratize economic participation in South Africa, we are always going to be confronted by these groups that exploit grievances, using, in fact, very legitimate concerns in order to cement themselves and force their way into economic participation.
Does it look like those in power and business leaders are in fact alive to this reality and what it has created?
Mainly not. So I wrote a piece ahead of the Nasrec conference of the ANC, the Nasrec 2, in terms of which I argued that the stakes at the conference were more about contending varieties of capture as opposed to good versus evil. What makes us comfortable as South Africans with an ANC that is more prone to support the rule of law is the fact that the kind of systemic capture they enable is not the one that is so destructive as to at least exclude the meaningful participation of those who can obtain education and be able to fend for themselves in the economy of South Africa. The people who are affected by that are people who have no way to participate meaningfully in the South African economy, and as a result, need a new deal in order for them to participate. Unfortunately, those people have been represented so far by rogue elements within the political elite. So we've had a very difficult choice as South Africans of choosing between people who are doing some good for the country, but not in a radically different way that can help, democratize economic participation, versus rogues who claim that that is what their intention is. But all that theirs is grievance exploitation that centers themselves and their groups, rather than meaningful, radical economic transformation as South Africa needs. We are in a point where, Vuyo, people think that the call to democratize South Africa's economy is only driven by political imperative. South Africa is a very small domestic economy. To have so many people not be able to actually have income and improve the buying power for goods and services here. But South African capital is indifferent to that reality because they have been able to move goods and services outside the country through free movement of goods and services, and in fact money outside the country as well. And that makes them indifferent to the realities of needing to develop a domestic economy because their goods and services can be exported easily elsewhere. This is not an anti-export argument. This is an argument that I'm making that says, if we explored reaching through, we've seen success stories, for example, of Capitec and Daily Sun, among others, where if you start creating solutions that bring many people who are currently marginalized, it makes business sense. So South Africa needs to open up its economy more for domestic penetration to areas where people are not only consumers, by the way, but are also makers of goods and services. If you look at, the proliferation of agriculture in very marginalized areas where people have got good quality output that cannot reach the rest of the South African market because of that concentration that I was talking about, as well as unfavorable logistics that can help them move products that are very good for the domestic or even export market. But there's debilitating infrastructure that continues to have those people at the margins of the economy, notwithstanding the fact that they've got goods and services that they can provide to the rest of the country.
Dr. Mtimka, thank you very much for your time, and we indeed look forward to your passionate insights in the new year. And once again, congratulations on this milestone.
Thank you for having me.
Dr. Ongama Mtimka, of course, got his PhD this past year. More on our analysts who we've been having over the year in a moment. Let's take a quick break. In July this year, another regular contributor to the show, Professor Mcebisi Ndletyana, was appointed Professor of Political Science by the University of Johannesburg. His inaugural lecture was titled Public Institutions and Political Culture, an offshoot of history and exigencies of the moment. Here's an excerpt from that lecture.
Magnanimity, inclusiveness and equality, all qualities that underpin and molded public culture and institutions in this country, were a product of our own long history. They are an expression of our collective identity. Departing from this strong institutional footing, the post-apartheid elite, however, soon began to show signs of a weakening resolve to pursue public policies that, though unpopular, were necessary for long-term sustainability of the transformative project. Alongside the creeping resort to expediency was the lack of vigilance to adopt what were introduced as transitional measures to the new changing context. One such transitional measure that lapsed into permanence by default was the elevation of the role of politicians in the employment of bureaucrats. Admittedly, political involvement was forced by the unpalatable composition of the bureaucracy and inheritance from the apartheid order. A number of civil servants were apartheid loyalists whose commitment to pursue new policies was questionable, and they were retained for the initial 5 years as part of the post-apartheid settlement to ease their acceptance of the new order. Instead of the Public Service Commission, as was the case previously, politicians made appointments of executive managers throughout the various layers of the state. Most of the appointees were drawn from the ranks of the progressive individuals that were part of the NGO sector and the academy. The new party in power kept a close eye on the appointments to a point of setting up a committee that would influence their new recruits. For a governing party elected based on its manifesto, the keen interest on the new bureaucrats was not unusual. New within government, having demonstrated their commitment to the public good through self-sacrifice, there was no reason to believe that the new political elite would abuse this power. There was laxity in creating institutional measures that would preempt abuse and guarantee the independence of civil servants. Perhaps worse than laxity was the failure to heed the signs of self-aggrandizement that cropped up in the early years. As laws were being formulated to create proper separation of roles, politicians exploited their involvement in the allocation of tenders to their own benefit. They set up companies and did business with the state, especially in the municipalities. When new laws were finally introduced by 2004, councillors had become too accustomed to abusing their power for self-gain. It was too late for them to retreat, and so they continued. Seeing that managers were now responsible for deciding on allocation of tenders, they insisted on appointing their own managers they could manipulate to issue tenders to their own proxies. Some managers willingly went along with this manipulation for their own financial benefit. Those who declined were forced to comply to ensure that they were reappointed. Councillors who hold power to hire and fire did not take kindly to those who declined their improper approaches. They would even fight among themselves over who should be appointed. Some of these fights have led to vacancies and unending interim appointments to the detriment of service delivery. And because they dispense patronage, inefficient and malfeasant managers never faced consequences. The Auditor General's constant reminders to investigate possible fraud and malfeasance were hardly followed up. Scant attention to the use of the public purse reflected the disposition of the political elite towards the state. To them, the state had ceased being an instrument for transformation. It had become a source of livelihood for themselves. This was not entirely surprising. They had no alternative source of employment. Involvement in the anti-apartheid struggle resulted in prison, exile, and expulsion from school. They did not have qualifications for gainful employment elsewhere. And the precarity of their only source of employment, that is the public service, or rather the public office, led them towards building a nest for an uncertain future. So they rationalized their plunder of public resources. Their predatory activities, however, led to the neglect of the proper functioning of the state. Companies have had to uproot their operations in search of other towns where councils would hopefully heed their pleas for proper roads and timely approval of licenses. Such relocations led to decline of the local revenue that is already slim. This in turn makes it even more difficult for municipalities to maintain their infrastructure. The new government had decided earlier on that the grants it provides to the municipalities should be used strictly to install the new infrastructure. That decision made sense. There was no infrastructure to maintain in the townships. Townships needed new infrastructure to be installed. But it then said, for the infrastructure to be maintained, municipalities must generate their own tax. So without the ability to make their own tax, it means that they cannot maintain their own infrastructure. Not paying attention to the local revenue has meant that the old infrastructure has been left to rot. Water leakages amounting to 30% of water in some areas are now commonplace. Besides not doing their duties, the gloomy state of the local revenue that characterizes most municipalities is also a culmination of decisions that were taken for immediate electoral gains. Though deciding to enforce people to pay for rates and taxes, local leaders in the mid-90s never followed up to ensure that people actually paid. When people protested saying even those who could pay, when they started protesting that they didn't want to pay, local leaders easily gave up because to insist was to risk losing votes. So residents got used to non-payment, leaving municipalities with little, if anything, in terms of taxes to maintain their infrastructure. The current state of public institutions therefore reflects our politics, public activism, and political culture. Their weaknesses are a collective indictment. They benefit some whilst indifferent to the plight of most in society. The beneficiaries have little interest in their improvement. This explains their decline. Where change has happened, it is because certain brave individuals have done so. One such rare change was triggered by former Auditor General Kimi Makwetu. His efforts to get politicians to curb wasteful expenditure had gone unheeded for years. Instead of continuing to rely on the politicians, Makwetu turned to the Chief Justice of the Constitutional Court, Mogoeng. He invited him to an international gathering of AGs who had come from across the world, and Makwetu proposed to Mogoeng that he must issue a call that his findings should be binding. And the Court had just done the same in relation to the public protector. So Mogoeng realized that because the public protector did the same function as the AG, he should issue a similar binding call. And Mogoeng did that. Politicians complied because they were ashamed. At the time, they had faced public outrage for being complicit in the wastage of resources at Nkandla. Parliament was seen to be complicit in that scandal. And so legislators introduced new law to redeem themselves. Makwetu had realized the potential of the moment to offer change and seized it. There may not be many Makwetus out there. For transformative, sustainable changes to happen, much wider societal agitation is needed. Political costs prompt politicians into action. The present rumblings are encouraging, but South Africa is crying for much more. Inefficiencies of public institutions reflect our own collective weaknesses. Only an active and outraged citizenry can effect meaningful change. Vukani bantu.
Asanda Ngwasheng is no stranger to the Watchdog, having been a regular voice on many of our panel conversations. This year, she made headlines after conducting a diversity workshop at Fishhook High School in the Western Cape. The training followed an incident in May when a teacher at the school allegedly used racial slurs during a lesson. Ngwasheng's task was not only to put South Africa's painful past into context, but it was also to highlight its lingering effects on present-day society. The diversity training did not go down well with some. The furore caused by the incident reignited conversations around race relations in South Africa. Asanda Ngwasheng was unable to join us for that conversation as all the media coverage of the Fishhook High incident was starting to take a toll on her. But Andile Mngxitama, a Black First Land First leader, Sarah Gon, director at Free Speech South Africa, and Hendrik Makaneta, the deputy chair of the Foundation of Education and Social Justice, were my guests on the day.
People have made apologies. They have felt sorry for what they've said, or that it hurt people. Sometimes it's been accepted, sometimes it hasn't. The person giving the apology doesn't have control over that process. And that's why the education and teaching parties from both sides, or from all sides, depending, it can be a range of, it needn't necessarily be merely black-white, it can be cultural differences, it can be a range of things. It is sensitive, they are complex, they are emotive, and they aren't always amenable to immediate understanding by those who are deemed to have perpetrated something racist they've said or acted. And that's what our main concern is, that if you do want a non-racist society, which I think is what we would strive for, and it is a constitutional imperative, it's probably one of the most difficult things to get right, is to see an adjustment to attitudes, to get people to understand better. And to be honest, I think children often don't know our history per se well enough, or don't even.
Well, hence the intervention. But is it about understandings, misunderstandings? Is it about this being difficult to actually deal with?
No, only the beneficiaries of racism will complicate the picture. We have to take the 400 years of systematic oppression of black people, accept that South Africa is a racist country. White people occupy positions of power in this country. They have the land, they have the economy. Even now we're speaking in the language of white people. So we must start from certain knowns. South Africa is a racist country. White people are beneficiaries of racism. And in fact, what is happening now is white people are protecting their children from even understanding how they got to the position of privilege. So white child will grow in South Africa today, see black people live in squatter camps, then their relationship with black people is one of being helpers, being garden boys, and so on. So this becomes a naturalized situation where the white child believes that somehow, because of their whiteness, they deserve the position that they hold in society. They will not know how they arrived here. And their parents are making sure that they don't know what happened in this country to give white people such a head start in all these situations. But what I think is happening in that school and many other schools is the protection of white privileges. We are not going to deal with the issue of racism as long as we allow racists to use constitutional language to stop the process of transformation. We must be very aggressive as the black majority, that every school must have an anti-racism policy. And that policy must explain what racism is, where racism comes, who benefits from racism. Up to today, white kids sitting in that class are beneficiaries of racism. And black kids sitting in that class are victims of racism. You know, we see it happening even at your universities, where white children believe they have this freedom to do as they wish with black people. Because from home, church, school, they are protected from the truth of their whiteness and what it means to be white in this society means you have all the privileges which black people don't have. And it's unearned privileges. In fact, it is unethical to be white. Absolutely.
Sorry.
Yes, of course, you can laugh. You laugh at genocide. You have not paid reparations for all the genocides that white people have done in America, even here. You can laugh. But you know that the Jewish people get their reparations because they are white. We have not got the reparation for colonialism, for apartheid, and it continues. Our children today are suffering because South Africa is a racist country. We as a black majority have a serious task to address this problem. But we have a situation where white people are so organized. Politically, is the DA, is the Freedom Front Plus, in the civil society, you have AfriForum, you have a new thing now called Freedom of Expression, something which all have money coming from Stellenbosch, controlling the national discourse, accepted by our media as civil society. Racist projects which are normalized to defend white interests and white racism using a constitutional language. We must disrupt this and insist on justice, starting from, it's not complicated racism. The black child, we start from the experience and how the black child received the situation. You start from the victim. It's not complicated at all. If we start from centering the experiences and feelings of the victims, that is the basis from which we start to move. It is not complicated at all. White people are racist, are beneficiaries of racism. Our schools are zones of anti-blackness, and our children are suffering as we speak. And we can no longer allow the situation to perpetuate itself.
Hendrik, you have an advantage that none of us here has. You've been privileged enough to sit together with decision makers and talk about these matters as you did when you were part of the Lekgotla. What is the government's understanding of why we are still where we are, and what is the thinking around what needs to happen and when?
Well, Vuyo, I must say, I'm listening to what Andile is saying, and to a large extent, I think that Andile is putting a blanket approach, to say that white people are racist. But in my view, Vuyo, and I'm sure you may agree with me, not all white people in our country are racist.
Which white person is not a beneficiary of racism? Which white person is not a beneficiary of racism?
Okay, of course, whites benefited from the system of racism. I agree with that. But I'm just saying, as we speak now, I want to move from the premise that begins to say not every white person in South Africa is a racist. And,
but all of them are beneficiaries of racism.
Allow me.
Okay, let's allow him to speak.
Cite examples. I can cite the example of the late Joe Slobo, who fought alongside black people in this country to make sure that the liberation of the black majority is attained. There are many others. If you look at Kalni House, you always see him with black people But not only those two, there are many other examples. We work with whites. There are those who are really committed to building this country. There are many white people who want to see South Africa move forward. And therefore, we cannot put a blanket approach and say all of them are racist. And of course, those who are racist should be identified. I think that our guest has already indicated. It's not an easy thing to really, identify and creep out a racist in society. Racism is with us. It has been with us for many years. And I think that it will continue to be with us because, it's a question of mindset. If people don't want to change, really, we don't necessarily have a dustbin for human beings where we can say we are going to place all racists in this dustbin. I mean, if people are prosecuted, just like criminals in society, not all criminals will be rehabilitated. There are those who go to jail and still come back, hardcore criminals. So, Buyo, the issue of racism is a very difficult issue to address in a sense that even, issues of evidence. I mean, if you go to court, if you accuse somebody and say, this one is a racist, you may have to present the necessary evidence. And at this stage, I think for the past 27 years, we have not been able to concretely deal with these issues fundamentally, except, of course, those that were caught in social media, where they said something that is racist and so on. But other than that, if somebody is going to be quiet, Buyo, and not, and just practice racism silently, I think that, we are really beating about the bush. But the fundamental issue that I want to indicate is that South Africans in general agree that we must coexist. That first and foremost, South Africa belongs to all of us who live in it, black and white. And we must continue to strive for the unity of purpose. We must continue to strive to build this united non-racial society as mandated by the Constitution. I know my friend Andile may not necessarily agree with the Constitution, but it's there. And if there are any changes that needs to be done, Andile also knows Parliament has to be constituted. We had 2/3 majority at some point, and nothing was done to change a wide range of issues that we are today crying about. I mean, the issue of land, for example. The ANC-led government at some point had a 2/3 majority. They had an opportunity to transform or to address the land question, but they did not do it. And I think that as of now, it is very clear that we are now moving towards, a coalition, a government, meaning that it is really going to be difficult to address the land question without the 2/3 majority in Parliament.
And that's our show for tonight. Do join us again tomorrow evening, same time.